I still remember the way my child's fingers trembled around the cardboard sign, the string cutting into their small neck, the words written in thick black marker like a sentence passed down by people who were supposed to love us most. Family disgrace. The sun was bright that afternoon, cruelly cheerful, as if it didn't know it was shining on something unforgivable. My parents stood on the porch, arms crossed, faces hard with that familiar righteousness they always wore when they believed they were doing what's best. My sister's kid was inside the living room, sprawled on the sofa, laughing at some cartoon, occasionally peeking through the window and giggling like this was a game. I asked them to stop. I begged. I dropped my pride right there on the cracked concrete and begged again. My mother told me this was a lesson. My father said shame builds character. My sister smirked and said, if you raise them better, this wouldn't be necessary. I took the sign off my child myself. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely untee the knot. My child didn't cry. That was the part that broke me the most. They just looked up and asked, very quietly, am I really bad? I didn't scream. I didn't threaten. I didn't curse them out the way they deserved. I picked my child up, walked away from that house, and something inside me closed forever. That night, after my child fell asleep curled against me like they were afraid I might disappear, I made a promise. Not of revenge born from rage, but of justice built slowly, carefully, and permanently. For years, I had been the family fixer, the quiet one, the reliable one. I paid bills when my parents fell short. I handled paperwork they didn't understand. I lent money my sister never repaid. I smoothed things over, swallowed insults, and told myself family meant endurance. That night, I stopped enduring. The next morning, I changed passwords. Bank access first, then utilities, then the online accounts I managed for my parents' small rental property. I didn't steal anything. I simply stepped back into the exact position they had assigned me without realizing it, the one who kept everything running. I informed them politely that I needed space and would no longer be involved in family matters for a while. My mother replied with a thumbs up emoji. My sister left me on read. Week 1 was quiet, peaceful even. My child started sleeping through the night again. They stopped flinching when someone raised their voice. I enrolled them in a new school closer to our small apartment and told no one our address. When my child smiled again, really smiled, I knew I was doing the right thing. Week 3, the cracks began to show. The tenants in my parents' rental couldn't get repairs approved. My parents didn't understand the emails or the late notices. They called me once, then twice. I didn't answer. My sister's husband texted asking for help with a loan application I had always handled. I replied calmly that I was unavailable. By the end of the first month, the tone changed. My mother left a voicemail saying she didn't understand why I was being so cold. My father said families forgive. My sister accused me of being dramatic and reminded me that kids forget these things. My child didn't forget, but I didn't remind them either. I let healing happen quietly. In the second month, consequences grew teeth. The rental income stopped when tenants moved out. Late fees stacked up. My parents discovered that the simple systems they mocked me for being obsessed with were the only reason they'd stayed afloat. My sister, meanwhile, was facing trouble of her own. The same kid who laughed from the sofa had been caught bullying a classmate. The school demanded meetings, documentation, plans. The plans I used to write. The meetings I used to attend with her. No one laughed then. They started showing up. First my sister, unannounced, standing outside my door with red eyes and an apology that never quite reached my child's name. I didn't let her in. A week later, my parents came together, holding groceries like offerings. My mother cried. My father avoided my eyes. They said they missed us. They said they'd made a mistake. They said they were worried. I listened. I said nothing. The third month was when they finally broke. Not financially, not completely, but in pride. They asked outright for help. They admitted they didn't know how to fix what they'd done. They asked to see my child. I invited them to a public park on a Saturday afternoon. Neutral ground. Safe ground. My child held my hand tightly as they approached, eyes cautious but curious. My parents looked older, somehow smaller. My sister wasn't there. That was my condition. My mother knelt and apologized directly to my child. Not to me, to my child. She said the words were wrong, that the punishment was cruel, that love should never look like humiliation. My father followed, voice shaking, admitting he had chosen authority over compassion. I watched carefully, not for tears, but for understanding. Then I spoke. I told them what that day had cost them. Not money, not convenience. Trust. I told them they would never again discipline my child. They would never speak about shame or disgrace in my presence. If they wanted to be part of our lives, it would be on my terms, slowly, with boundaries they didn't get to negotiate. I told them my child would decide in time how close they wanted to be. They agreed, immediately, desperately. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm, powerful in a way I never had before, because the revenge wasn't in watching them suffer. It was in showing them that access to us was a privilege they had to earn back, not a right they could abuse. That night, as I tucked my child into bed, they asked if the family was still mad at them. I kissed their forehead and told them the truth. No, I said. They were wrong. And they're learning. My child smiled, small but certain, and turned toward the wall to sleep. 3 months earlier, they had stood alone with a sign meant to brand them forever. Now, the people who held the marker were the ones asking for forgiveness. And this time, I was the one deciding what the lesson would be. The moment that changed everything didn't arrive with shouting or chaos, but with a kind of quiet cruelty that cuts deeper than any scream ever could. It happened in broad daylight, in front of the very house where I had grown up believing family meant protection. My parents stood there with stiff faces and folded arms, convinced they were doing the right thing, while my child, my own flesh and blood, was forced to stand still with a cardboard sign hanging from their neck. The words, "Family Disgrace," were written in bold, uneven letters, as if someone had pressed the marker harder to make sure the shame sank in deep. I remember how the cardboard brushed against my child's chest every time they shifted their weight, how the string rubbed red against their skin, and how their eyes kept darting around, searching for someone to make it stop. What made it unbearable wasn't just the sign itself, but the message behind it. This wasn't discipline. This wasn't love disguised as toughness. This was humiliation, carefully chosen and deliberately public. Neighbors passed by. A delivery bike slowed. Someone glanced, then looked away. Every second felt like an eternity, each one carving the idea into my child's mind that they were somehow defective, a stain that needed to be displayed so everyone could see. I could feel my chest tightening, my heart pounding in my ears. But when I looked at my parents, there was no hesitation in their eyes. They believed this was justified. Inside the house, through the open door, my sister's child sat comfortably on the couch, legs tucked up, laughing at something on the television. The sound drifted out, bright, carefree laughter, so painfully out of place that it felt unreal. Every now and then, they glanced outside, saw my child standing there with the sign, and laughed harder, like this was some twisted form of entertainment. No one corrected them. No one told them to stop. The contrast was sharp and unmistakable, one child shamed as an example, the other protected as a favorite. I asked them to stop, at first calmly, thinking surely they'd come to their senses. I said this was too far, that whatever mistake my child had made didn't justify this. My mother waved me off and said children need to learn consequences. My father told me that embarrassment builds character, that the world is harsh and family has to prepare kids for it. My sister didn't even pretend to care. She tilted her head, looked at my child like they were something unpleasant, and said that maybe if I had raised them properly, this wouldn't have happened. That was the moment I understood that this wasn't about teaching a lesson. It was about control. It was about power. It was about reminding me, and my child, exactly where we stood in the family hierarchy. I felt something inside me crack, not loudly, but completely. I stopped arguing because I realized there was no point. You can't reason with people who mistake cruelty for morality. I walked over to my child and knelt down in front of them. Their hands were clenched into tight little fists, knuckles pale. Their lips were pressed together, holding something back. I asked softly if they were okay, and they nodded, even though their eyes were shiny. I reached for the string, and my fingers shook so badly it took me a few tries to untee it. When the sign finally dropped to the ground, it made a dull sound, like something heavy falling. I picked my child up, feeling how light they were in my arms, how tense their body felt against mine. They didn't cry. That hurt more than if they had screamed. Instead, they rested their head against my shoulder and whispered, "Am I really bad?" That question echoed in my mind long after we left. No child should ever ask that because of their own family. In that moment, I knew this was a wound that wouldn't heal quickly, if ever, unless I acted. I didn't yell at my parents. I didn't threaten to cut them off or promise revenge. I simply walked away. I could feel their eyes on my back, could almost hear their thoughts, how dramatic I was being, how I'd cool down and come back like I always did. They didn't realize that something fundamental had shifted. The version of me who tolerated being overlooked, dismissed, and used was gone. That night, after I put my child to bed, I sat alone in the dark and replayed the scene over and over. The sign, the laughter from inside, the way my parents justified it without a second thought. I realized that the deepest betrayal wasn't even the humiliation itself, but the certainty with which they believed my child deserved it. They didn't see a vulnerable human being. They saw a symbol, a warning, a tool to enforce obedience. That realization hardened into resolve. I understood that as long as I kept trying to earn their approval, this dynamic would never change. My child would always be at risk of being sacrificed for the comfort or ego of others. So I made a choice, right there in that quiet room, that everything from that point on would be different. I wouldn't fight them with words, because words had failed. I would protect my child with action, even if that meant dismantling the entire structure that had allowed this to happen. The humiliation they inflicted was meant to break my child and bring me back into line. Instead, it exposed the truth so clearly that I could never unsee it. That single afternoon stripped away every illusion I had about family loyalty and fairness. It showed me exactly who they were willing to hurt and exactly how far they were willing to go. And once you see something like that, you don't forget it. You don't excuse it. You don't move past it without change. That day became the beginning of everything, not because of the pain itself, but because of what it awakened in me. A certainty that my child's dignity mattered more than family approval, a clarity that love without respect is not love at all, and a quiet, unshakable determination that no one would ever be allowed to make my child feel like a disgrace again, no matter who they were. After that day, I didn't announce my departure or make a dramatic show of cutting anyone off. I simply stopped calling, stopped fixing, stopped smoothing things over when tension crept in. For years, I had been the invisible glue holding everyone together, the one who stepped in before things fell apart, so no one else had to feel uncomfortable. I managed accounts, filled out forms, made phone calls, remembered deadlines, and lent money that it was never returned. I did it because I believed that being useful was the same as being loved. Walking away from that role felt strange at first, like stepping out of a costume I'd worn for so long I forgot it wasn't my skin. The silence in the beginning was almost peaceful. No one checked in to ask how my child was doing. No one apologized. That alone told me everything I needed to know. If I had reached out, they would have welcomed me back with the same expectations as before, pretending nothing had happened. Instead, I let the quiet stretch. I focused on my child, on the way they watched the door when it opened, on how they hesitated before speaking, as if they were afraid the wrong words might get them in trouble again. I kept my voice calm, my routine steady. Slowly, their shoulders began to relax. They slept better. They laughed again, cautiously at first, like they weren't sure laughter was allowed. While I was building safety for my child, the absence I left behind began to echo loudly in my parents' and sisters' lives. They didn't notice at first. They never had. They were used to things working, to problems resolving themselves, to money appearing when it was needed and paperwork being magically handled. That magic had always been me. When I stepped away, there was no announcement, no explanation, just the sudden weight of responsibility landing squarely where it belonged. The first call came from my mother. She left a voicemail, her tone confused rather than concerned. She said she was locked out of an account and didn't understand why. She asked if I had changed something by mistake. I listened to the message twice, then deleted it, not out of spite, but out of necessity. If I responded even to explain, I would be stepping back into the role I had abandoned. And I knew that once I did, it would be almost impossible to leave again. Days turned into weeks. Missed payments piled up. Emails went unanswered. I knew because I still had access to notifications, and every time I saw one, I felt a sharp mix of guilt and clarity. For the first time, I was letting them experience the consequences of their own choices, not because I had sabotaged anything, but because I had stopped preventing the fallout. There was a difference, and it mattered to me. My sister reached out next, not with concern but with irritation. She sent short, clipped messages asking why I wasn't responding, why things were suddenly so complicated. When I didn't reply, her frustration turned into accusations. She said I was being childish. She said family doesn't abandon family. I almost laughed at that, remembering my child standing alone with that sign. Family hadn't protected us then. Why was it my job to protect them now? As their lives grew more inconvenient, my resolve grew stronger. Each day that passed without my intervention reinforced the truth. They had relied on me without respecting me. They had benefited from my presence while dismissing my boundaries. And the moment I stepped away, the imbalance became impossible to ignore. They weren't missing me as a person. They were missing the labor I provided, the safety net I represented. Meanwhile, my child began to change in subtle but profound ways. They started speaking more freely, asking questions, expressing opinions without watching my face for signs of disapproval. One evening, while we were eating dinner, they said, "It's quieter now." I asked what they meant, and they shrugged, then smiled. "It feels nicer," they said. That single sentence affirmed everything I was doing. The peace in our small space was something I had never known growing up, and I realized how rare and precious it was. The second month brought more desperate attempts to pull me back in. My parents showed up at my door unannounced, carrying bags of groceries like peace offerings. I didn't let them in. I spoke to them through the door, calm but firm, telling them I wasn't ready to talk. My mother cried, saying she didn't understand why I was being punished. That word, punished, stuck with me. Even then, she saw herself as the victim. She couldn't see that this wasn't punishment at all. It was a boundary. They began to feel the weight of my absence in ways they couldn't ignore. Things broke and stayed broken. Bills went unpaid. Arguments erupted because there was no mediator to smooth things over. My sister, overwhelmed and unprepared, started snapping at everyone around her. The same patience and support she had taken for granted was suddenly gone, and she didn't know how to replace it. What surprised me most was how little satisfaction I felt watching this unfold. I had imagined revenge as something sharp and dramatic, a moment of triumph where they'd finally realize how wrong they were. Instead, it was quiet and heavy, like watching a structure slowly collapse under its own design flaws. There was no joy in it, only a sense of inevitability. This was always going to happen. I had just delayed it by holding everything together. As the weeks passed, I understood something crucial. By stepping away, I wasn't just protecting my child. I was reclaiming myself. I was learning that my worth wasn't tied to how much I could give or fix or endure. The distance gave me clarity, and with clarity came strength. I no longer felt the need to explain myself or justify my choices. My silence spoke louder than any argument ever could. By the end of the second month, their messages changed. The anger drained out, replaced by uncertainty and fear. They asked if we could talk, if we could work things out. I didn't respond right away. I took time to consider what I wanted, what my child needed, and what conditions would be non-negotiable if I ever allowed them back into our lives. Stepping away had exposed the truth more clearly than confrontation ever would have. It showed them what life looked like without my constant support, and it showed me what life looked like without their constant judgment. In that space, something powerful happened. I realized that revenge didn't have to be loud or cruel. Sometimes, the most devastating response is simply to stop playing the role you were forced into and let people face the reality they worked so hard to ignore. By the time the consequences began to reach them fully, I was no longer watching with anticipation or anger. I was simply aware. Their world, which had always seemed so solid and unquestionable, started to wobble in ways they didn't know how to manage. Without me quietly absorbing the pressure, small problems became overwhelming. Things they had always dismissed as not a big deal suddenly demanded attention, patience, and effort they didn't have. And for the first time, no one stepped in to rescue them. My parents were the first to feel it deeply. They had grown used to authority without responsibility, to giving orders without understanding the work behind them. When repairs went undone and finances tangled into confusion, they grew anxious. They argued more. My mother complained about feeling disrespected by people who used to listen. My father grew quiet, weighed down by decisions he didn't know how to make. They told themselves this chaos was temporary, that I'd come back once I cooled off. But as days turned into weeks, that certainty eroded into something closer to fear. My sister's unraveling was louder. She was used to leaning on me while pretending she didn't need me. Without that support, her frustration spilled into every corner of her life. She snapped at her spouse. She struggled with her child's school issues I had always handled with calm emails and careful planning. The same child who had laughed from the safety of the sofa now faced consequences of their own, and my sister didn't know how to guide them without resorting to the same harshness she had once defended. Watching her repeat the pattern was painful, but it also confirmed something I needed to see: nothing would change if I went back too soon. The messages they sent me shifted in tone as the weeks passed. At first, they were sharp, accusing me of being selfish, dramatic, ungrateful. When that didn't work, they turned confused, asking what they had done wrong, insisting they didn't mean it like that. Eventually, desperation crept in. My mother wrote long messages about how families fall apart when people hold grudges. My father spoke of age and health, subtly reminding me of my duty. My sister oscillated between anger and pleading, blaming stress, circumstances, anyone but herself. What struck me was what none of them said. Not once did they ask how my child was doing. Not once did they acknowledge the depth of what they had inflicted. Their apologies, when they came, were vague and conditional, wrapped in explanations and excuses. We were trying to teach a lesson. You know we didn't mean harm. You're taking this too seriously. Each message revealed the same truth. They wanted relief, not understanding. Resolution, not accountability. As this unfolded, I noticed how different my reactions were compared to the past. The old me would have rushed in, soothed egos, minimized pain, accepted half apologies just to restore balance. This time I felt steady. Their distress no longer triggered panic in me. Instead, it reinforced the boundary I had built. I wasn't causing their suffering. I was simply no longer shielding them from it. There were moments when guilt tried to creep in, late at night when the house was quiet and doubts whispered that maybe I was being too hard, too unforgiving. In those moments, I remembered my child's question, "Am I really bad?" That memory cut through every doubt like a blade. I reminded myself that accountability is not cruelty, and that protecting my child was not an overreaction. It was my responsibility. The turning point came when they finally asked for help outright. Not subtly, not disguised as concern. They admitted they were overwhelmed. They said they didn't know how to fix things. They asked if I could step back in, even temporarily. It was the first honest thing they had said, and it mattered. But honesty alone wasn't enough. I took time before responding. I talked with my child, not about details, but about feelings. I asked how they felt when they thought about seeing their grandparents again. I listened carefully, without pushing. My child said they were scared but curious. They said they didn't want to be yelled at or embarrassed ever again. I promised them that wouldn't happen. And I meant it. When I finally agreed to meet, it was on neutral ground with clear boundaries set beforehand. No minimizing, no justifications, no blaming. I watched my parents closely as we talked. For the first time, they listened without interrupting. When I described the impact of that day, the fear, the shame, the lasting damage, I didn't soften my words. I didn't raise my voice either. I let the truth stand on its own. My mother cried, not the dramatic tears meant to end conversations, but quiet ones that seemed to come from recognition. My father apologized without explanation. That mattered more than anything he could have said. My sister wasn't there, and that was intentional. Some lessons require distance. I made it clear that help would not mean a return to the old dynamic. I would not resume managing their lives. I would not accept disrespect in exchange for peace. Any relationship going forward would be limited, conditional, and centered on my child's safety and dignity. They agreed quickly, perhaps too quickly, but I knew trust would take time to rebuild. Walking away from that meeting, I felt something unexpected: relief. Not because they were struggling, but because I had finally allowed the natural consequences of their actions to exist. I had stopped confusing love with sacrifice and loyalty with silence. The power had shifted, not through dominance, but through refusal to be mistreated. Their unraveling wasn't the goal. It was the result. The real change happened inside me, in the quiet certainty that I no longer needed their approval to define my worth or my child's future. Watching them face the discomfort they had avoided for so long wasn't satisfying in the way revenge stories often promise. It was sobering, necessary, final. By letting consequences speak louder than confrontation, I ensured that if they wanted a place in our lives, it would be on terms shaped by respect, not fear. And for the first time, that balance felt right. When they finally came back, it wasn't with confidence or authority, but with hesitation that showed in every step they took. The people who once stood so certain in their judgment now looked unsure of where they were allowed to stand. I could see it in the way my parents paused before speaking, as if measuring every word, afraid of saying the wrong thing. I could hear it in my sister's voice when she eventually called, softer than I'd ever known it to be, stripped of the sharp edge she used to hide behind. The desperation wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, heavy, and real. They asked to meet again. This time, not to explain themselves, not to argue, but to ask what they could do. That alone told me how far things had shifted. The balance of power, which had once leaned so heavily in their favor, had finally tipped. I agreed, but only after making my expectations clear. There would be no pretending, no rushing forgiveness, no pressure on my child. They accepted every condition without hesitation, because for the first time, they understood that they were the ones asking for access, not granting it. The meeting was different from the last. There were no long speeches, no attempts to reframe the past as a misunderstanding. They listened, truly listened. When my child spoke, haltingly at first, then with more confidence, they didn't interrupt. My child said they were scared that day, scared and confused, scared that love could disappear so suddenly. My mother covered her mouth with her hand, tears slipping through her fingers. My father's shoulders slumped, the weight of that realization settling in. This wasn't about pride anymore. It was about damage. I watched carefully, not just for emotion, but for responsibility. I needed to see whether they understood that what they'd done couldn't be undone with apologies alone. When my mother said, "I don't know how we thought that was okay," something in me loosened, not because it erased the pain, but because it acknowledged reality without excuses. My sister, when she finally spoke, admitted she had laughed it off because it was easier than questioning the way our parents handled things. She said she didn't want to admit how wrong it felt, because that would mean facing her own choices as a parent. Even then, I didn't rush to reassure them. I didn't say everything would be fine. I made it clear that forgiveness, if it came, would be a process, not an event. I told them that my child's safety, emotional and physical, was non-negotiable. Any sign of shaming, humiliation, or favoritism would mean immediate distance again. No warnings, no second chances. I could see fear flicker across their faces at that, but I didn't soften it. Boundaries only work when they are real. What surprised me was how empowering it felt to say those words calmly. There was no anger in my voice, no shaking. I wasn't threatening. I was stating facts. For years, I had been afraid that setting boundaries would make me cruel or unloving. In that moment, I understood the opposite was true. Boundaries were an act of love for my child and for myself. As weeks passed, they tried. Awkwardly at first. My parents asked permission before giving advice. They checked in before visiting. They spoke to my child with care, sometimes overly careful, like people learning a new language. My sister struggled more. Old habits don't disappear easily, but when she slipped, when her tone sharpened or impatience crept in, I corrected it immediately. Once, calmly but firmly, I ended a visit early. No arguments, no explanations, just action. The message landed louder than any lecture ever could. My child noticed the change. One evening, after a short visit, they asked, "Why are they being nicer now?" I told them the truth in simple words. Because they learned that hurting people has consequences. My child thought about that for a moment, then nodded. "I like this better," they said. So did I. The begging didn't stop right away. There were moments when my parents asked for things to go back to how they used to be, when my sister hinted that I was holding on to the past. Each time, I reminded them gently but firmly that we weren't going backward. The old way had led to harm. There was nothing to return to. We were building something new, or we were building nothing at all. What made this stage of the journey so powerful wasn't their struggle, it was my clarity. I no longer questioned myself. I no longer wondered if I was being too harsh or too sensitive. I knew exactly why I was doing what I was doing, and that certainty made me unmovable. Watching them adjust to that reality was strange, almost surreal. They were learning to exist in a relationship where they didn't hold all the control, where respect wasn't optional. Over time, the apologies became less frequent, not because they mattered less, but because understanding replaced them. My parents began to correct themselves without prompting. My sister started parenting differently, less reactive, more thoughtful. I didn't credit myself for that change, but I recognized that accountability had forced reflection in ways comfort never had. The most important shift, though, was internal. I stopped seeing myself as someone who had to earn space in other people's lives. I stopped equating forgiveness with access. I learned that reconciliation, when it happens, should come with conditions that protect the most vulnerable. My child saw that too. They saw an adult choose them without hesitation, choose dignity over approval. That was the real revenge. Not watching them suffer, not hearing them beg, but standing in my power and refusing to give it back. It was knowing that the people who once felt entitled to shame my child now had to prove they were worthy of being around them. It was transforming pain into authority, silence into strength. And in doing so, I taught my child the most important lesson of all: no one gets to define your worth, not even family. What I didn't expect was how final everything would feel once the power truly shifted. Not dramatic, not loud, just settled. The kind of calm that comes when a door closes behind you, and you realize you don't need to keep checking if it might reopen. By the time I fully stepped into my authority, there was no thrill left in being right. There was only responsibility and a deep sense of peace that came with owning it. Access to my child was no longer something assumed. It was deliberate, measured, earned moment by moment. Visits were shorter. Conversations were supervised. I watched closely, not with suspicion, but with awareness. I paid attention to tone, to body language, to the subtle things people do when they think no one is watching. And when something felt off, I acted, immediately, calmly, without guilt. That alone marked a complete transformation from who I used to be. At first, my parents struggled with this new reality. They were polite, careful, almost overly so. They asked permission for everything. They sought reassurance that they were doing okay. I didn't rush to give it. Not because I wanted them to suffer, but because reassurance given too easily becomes meaningless. I needed consistency, not performance. I needed to see that respect wasn't something they put on like a coat for visits, but something they carried with them. My child noticed everything. Children always do. They noticed how visits ended early when boundaries were crossed. They noticed how apologies were expected to be followed by change. They noticed that I didn't argue or explain myself endlessly anymore. When something wasn't acceptable, I said so, and that was the end of it. No negotiations, no emotional bargaining, no fear that standing firm would cost me love. One evening, after a visit where my mother gently corrected herself mid-sentence, my child looked at me and said, "You're not scared anymore." It wasn't a question. It was an observation, and it hit me harder than anything else. Because they were right. I wasn't scared anymore, not of being disliked, not of being excluded, not of being labeled difficult or ungrateful. I had already lost the version of family that demanded my silence, and surviving that loss had stripped fear of its power. There were moments when my parents tried to test the edges of this new arrangement. Subtle comments, nostalgic sighs about how things used to be, suggestions that maybe I was being too strict. Each time, I responded the same way, not defensively, not angrily, but clearly. I reminded them that what used to be had hurt my child, that there was no version of closeness worth revisiting if it required tolerance of harm. And every time I held that line, it became easier to hold the next. My sister took longer to accept it. Control doesn't release its grip easily. There were moments of resentment, of quiet competition, of attempts to regain status through comparison. But the difference now was that I didn't engage. I didn't explain. I didn't justify. When she crossed a boundary, the consequence followed without drama. Visits paused. Calls went unanswered. Distance returned, slowly, unmistakably. She learned that access to us depended on behavior, not blood. What amazed me most was how this dynamic reshaped my child's understanding of relationships. They began to speak up when something made them uncomfortable. They asked questions instead of assuming blame. They stopped shrinking themselves to fit into other people's expectations. Watching that unfold was more satisfying than any apology I ever received. It was proof that the cycle had been interrupted. There came a moment, quiet, ordinary, when I realized I had stopped replaying the past. The image of my child with that sign no longer dominated my thoughts. It hadn't vanished, but it had lost its power to wound. It had transformed into a boundary marker, a line in the sand that defined everything that came after. It reminded me why these limits existed and why they could never be compromised. The people who once believed they could shame my child into obedience now approached us with humility. They chose their words carefully. They showed restraint. They respected decisions they didn't fully agree with. Not because they had become perfect, but because they understood something essential. They were no longer in control, and that control would never be returned. This wasn't cruelty. It wasn't punishment. It was reality. Power had shifted because responsibility had been claimed. I had stopped outsourcing my authority to people who had proven they would misuse it. I had accepted that being a parent sometimes means being the villain in someone else's story, and being at peace with that. The final lesson came quietly, without ceremony. One afternoon, my child was filling out a school form and paused at the section that asked for family. They looked up at me and asked who they should include. I told them the truth: anyone who treats you with respect and care. They smiled, nodded, and kept writing. No hesitation, no confusion, just clarity. That was when I knew the revenge was complete. Not because anyone had suffered enough. Not because apologies had finally been offered, but because my child would never again believe they deserved humiliation to belong. Because they had learned that love without dignity is not love at all. Because they had seen, in real time, what it looks like when someone chooses protection over approval. The people who once thought they could define us now lived within boundaries they didn't create. And I lived with the certainty that I would never hand that power back, no matter who asked, no matter how they begged. That wasn't anger. That was freedom.